The emperor's attendant bowed to indicate the end of the audience, but Hirohito turned to Nagumo one last time. "We would like to have the pictures remain in the palace, as we wish to show them to Her Imperial Majesty the Empress." Fuchida rose with the others and bowed as the emperor rose from his seat and slowly stepped from the platform and exited. Things could not have gone better. Late December 1941. Central Philippines University. Jimmy and Charma Cavell stood against a wall along Lopez Jaina Street, choked with people and bicycles under furious clouds of black smoke that filled the air with the sooty smell of war. It was worse than he had imagined, much worse. Jimmy had one arm across his chest, and with his other hand he kept stroking his unshaven cheeks and chin. About 1.5 miles away, explosions continued to rock the harbour. Intermittent car horns, crying children, and barking dogs were the only sounds rising from the street. No one talked. 2 Japanese warplanes roared overhead, frighteningly low. Jimmy watched blankly as cars and people flowed past, strapped and packed with as many goods as they could possibly carry, fleeing north from Iloilo City. 2 American jeeps and 3 troop trucks honked and navigated their way through the crowds. Jimmy turned to Charma. "I guess the Christmas break'll be extra long this year." He could see she wasn't amused. She was scared. He put his arm around her, then squeezed her shoulder. "Frank said we'll be travelling north about 50 miles, somewhere up near the mountains where we can stay with some families in Katipunan." He didn't have much to comfort Charma with, but it was all he had to give. Anyway, he was sure it wouldn't be like this for long. "The Americans will get things back to normal again. You'll see." Outside the Covell home, Frank pulled up in his black 34 Ford Tudor with a wooden chest precariously rope-tied to the back. He honked as Jimmy dragged a steamer trunk and Charma lugged 2 suitcases from their front door. "You, okay? You got that?" Jimmy glanced back as he walked out. "I'm all right. Just keep moving," Charma said. Cars puttered past, equally crammed full of personal goods from phonographs to mattresses. 2 students rode by on bicycles, boxes and crates littered every yard. Frank leaned over his wife, Gertrude, in the passenger seat and shouted out the window, "See you in the village. It's about a 90-minute drive. You know where you're going?" Yeah, Charma said as she dragged her luggage to their own car. "Thanks, Frank." Bouncing a basketball, Jimmy strolled up to Frank's side of the Ford. "You got room for this?" "No problem. I'll send my chauffeur to pick it up along with a box of toothpicks I left behind." Frank put the car in gear and let it lurch forward. "I take that as a no. You're no fun." "See you there." As Frank pulled away, Jimmy spun the basketball on one finger and quietly sang out the end of an old Negro spiritual, but without conviction. He's got the whole world in his hands. January 22nd, 1942. Rabaul, New Guinea. Leading a force of 109 Navy bombers, Fuchida alternately looked out both sides of his cockpit, observing each element of the attack force taking positions and gently descending toward the circular harbour. The ground was blackish-grey from the 1937 eruption of a nearby volcano. Royal Australian Air Force Headquarters, RAAF, Telecommunication Unit, Melbourne, Australia. The steady clacking of electric teletype machines rattled the offices of the RAF, as uniformed secretaries added to the orchestra of noise with their typewriters, each desk stacked with baskets of papers. 3 men in headphones sat at a bank of teletype machines, reading and furiously taking notes as an officer stood carefully observing. He leaned over an operator, focusing intently on the message appearing on one of the machines. The operator shook his head, tore off the sheet, and spun around in his swivel chair to hand it to the waiting officer. "From Rabaul, sir." The officer put on his glasses and read it out loud, stumbling through the words. "Nos morituri te salutamus." Yanking off his glasses, he said, "What the bloody hell do they mean by that?" The operator pushed his headset down to his neck, looked at the officer and spoke the Latin fluidly. "Nos morituri te salutamus." We who are about to die salute you. A saying from the gladiators. He paused for a moment. Sir, they've only got 8 operable aircraft. The officer's face fell as he crumpled the sheet in his fist. Lord, help them. Raboul. Machine guns from fighter planes ripped through the few parked airplanes as terrified airmen fled for cover and dove into ditches. In the harbour, ships were pounded into the sea in a blanket of geysers and fiery explosions. Fuchida chuckled to himself as his carrier-launched attack force came virtually unopposed upon the Australian airbase on the northeastern tip of the Australian territory of New Britain Island. The natural harbour that usually gave safe haven to its flying boats, critical for surveillance, was an open shooting gallery and was shown no mercy. Offshore, 7,500 troops were on their way to land and developed the strategically important Rabaul Harbour as a major naval and air base for Japan. Fuchida reached forward and patted his pilot's shoulder. We're wasting our resources. Too easy, like fishing in a koi pond. February 19th, 1942. Darwin, Australia. 2 young boys in straw hats sat fishing at the end of a pier in the harbour in the morning sunlight. No luck so far. One sighed as the other nudged him and motioned with his head to the cloudless sky. Near the horizon they could see what looked like a large group of birds. As they stared, they began to hear the drone of airplanes. They chucked their poles into the water and took off running down the pier. Leading an even larger wave of 188 attack aircraft, Fuchida looked carefully around him in the sunny skies, disgusted. No air cover at all. The Japanese combined fleet had received reports that the harbour city of Darwin was amassing ships and reinforcements and felt they had to respond. Fuchida picked up his speaker tube from his neck and said to his pilot, "Take positions. Commence attack." The pilot wagged his wings, signalling the rest of the formation to prepare to attack. In the undefended harbour below, bombers took their pick of the wide assortment of ships, from freighters and troop transports to USS Peary, an American destroyer, and began tearing into the helpless prey, filling the bay with echoing explosions and the sky with clouds of jet-black smoke. Fuchida aimed his bomb sight while ordering his pilot to drift right or left until he was on target, then released his payload onto a freighter, blowing it into 1,000,000 fragments in the bay. Looking below, despite the overwhelming success of his raid, he shook his head, feeling that Japan was wasting valuable time on objectives of little consequence while ignoring their real enemy, the United States. He feared that while they were busy snatching a fan from a geisha, the US was forging swords. February 1942, Katipunan, Panay, the Philippines. A barefoot Filipino, head to toe in white, led a carabao pulling his cart packed with sacks of rice and crates of live chickens that threw off feathers. The dirt road led past a small church and then by a white-plastered house, sitting in a small clearing among thick vegetation and tall palm trees. The mud and dust of the road stained the walls reddish-brown. Several trunks and boxes leaned beside the door. "President Roosevelt's pledged to send reinforcements," Frank said, sitting on an empty wooden crate in a living room jammed with furniture and suitcases. He wouldn't say that if he didn't mean it. Frank tugged his shirt in and out to dry the sweat. Eating a banana, Jimmy spoke with his mouth full. "But when? The Japanese have overrun Manila and they're moving south. Fast." He peeled his banana down a bit. "People are getting angry and tired of waiting. They say this isn't their fight, it's America's fight, so America needs to send help." Gertrude, Frank's wife, fanning herself with a magazine, added, "If the Japanese come to Panay, some people are saying that they'll just turn themselves in, go to internment camps and wait it out." Chalmer jumped in. "Oh, I hope it doesn't come to that." "I'd rather hide out in the jungle," Jimmy said, "and take my chances than go to a camp." He popped the last of the banana into his mouth. "No telling what'll happen in a camp. The Japanese don't look too highly on people who surrender." Frank nodded. "Yeah, I think that's the best bet. He looked down, shook his head and stood up. I can't even believe we're saying these things. A few months ago I was president of a college. Now I'm practically a hobo. True enough, but you have good friends. And bananas. Jimmy held out a banana. Have one. February 1942. Columbia Army Air Base, Columbia, South Carolina. Jake leaned against the edge of the entrance of a grey hangar beside a group of flyers, proudly wearing their cordovan leather flying jackets. They stood drinking coffee, puffing cigarettes and observing a flagman waving a twin-engine Mitchell B-25 bomber into its parking spot on the apron off the taxiway. The aircraft was easily recognizable by its double-fin tail. The engines revved up as the plane finished the turn, then shut down. Lieutenant Bill Farrow, a tall, lanky, blue-eyed pilot, stood beside Jake, whistling Green Eyes by Tommy Dorsey. The base was constructed just 2 years earlier as a civilian airport. The day after the Pearl Harbor raid, it was turned over for military use. Most of the buildings were little more than plywood covered with tar paper, but it had what the Army Air Corps needed for training, runways and hangars, which was what brought Jake and other flyers there. Blowing the steam off his coffee, Jake took a few steps to a freestanding blackboard when a jeep pulled up to a squeaky halt. The courier yelled out, "Hey, Jake, Captain wants to see you, on the double." "Well, what's the captain got against me?" Jake mumbled as he looked back at the eyes that all turned to him. Bill couldn't resist and spoke with his South Carolina drawl. "Ooh, sounds like the raccoon got caught sneaking in late again." "Damn!" Jake took a last puff off his cigarette and threw the butt into his coffee. "Kitchen patrol, here you come," Bill chided. Jake, the shortest guy on the base, looked up at Bill, snorted the smoke out of his nostrils, handed him his coffee mug, and hopped into the jeep. As Jake entered the office, he was surprised to see 24 other enlisted men lined up against the wall. He tried to discreetly take his place at the end, being the last one in the room. The captain wasn't upset, but he was all business and spoke tersely as he paced. "I've assembled you men because we're putting together a dangerous mission and we need some volunteers. Some of you fellas are going to get killed." He studied their faces as he paused, searching for the scent of fear. One of the men spoke up. Captain, sir, can we know some of the details?" "Negative. Even if you volunteer, you won't know until after you're on your way. Simply put, the mission is dead serious and will be extremely hazardous." He slowly looked across their attentive faces. "Now, how many of you want to sign up?" Jake felt himself just as patriotic as the rest, and equally mad at the Japanese and Germans as the next guy. But he didn't think there was any use volunteering for that job. "Some of you fellas are going to get killed. No thanks." He had no desire to get in on anything like that. The captain started at the far end opposite Jake and walked up to the first soldier. "Will you go?" He quickly nodded. "Yes, sir." "Yeah, I'll go." He went to the next. "Soldier, will you?" "Yes, sir. I'll go." Jake knew that sooner or later 1 or 2 would bow out, and that would be his cue to do likewise. He wasn't going. He had to stop himself from shaking his head no before someone noticed. After 24 yes answers, the captain stepped in front of Jake. "And will you go, soldier?" "Yes, sir. You can count on me, sir." He couldn't believe he was hearing the words come out of his own mouth. He realized he was going to wherever they were going, doing whatever they were going to do, and might never be coming back. Great. March 3rd, 1942. The southern coast of Java. Uchida's group of 180 aircraft headed toward the port city of Cilacap. The objective of the battle was to capture the harbour, preventing the Allied forces from retreating to Australia by sea. He scanned the anchorage for his targets, but there were few left. Only a few days earlier, the Japanese had landed 35,000 troops at 3 separate points on the northern side of the island, quickly overwhelming the poorly organised troops of the Dutch, British, Australians and Americans. The Japanese Navy had sunk 4 Allied ships with no losses of their own. Fuchida knew the importance of securing the prize of Java, as the island was the 4th largest exporter of oil in the world. Without this island firmly under their control, along with its precious lifeblood of petroleum, Japan could never survive. He was constantly surprised by the lopsided odds in their favour. Nothing could be easier. Using the bombing techniques he had honed for years, he positioned his group of 3 planes and set his bomb sight on a freighter. The bombardiers of the other 2 planes fixed their eyes on Fuchida's plane to release the moment he did. He let loose his payload onto the doomed ship below. Release? Perfect. As the plane passed the target, he looked back in time to see the ship impacted by a horrific blast that shook his plane, a pleasurable sign of success. No doubt they'd have all the oil they'd ever need. March 1942. Elgin Air Base, Florida. Jake's B-25 thundered over a riverbed at 165 miles an hour. So low, off to the side, he was looking straight into the mud-dried banks whizzing past. As bombardier, Jake was right up front in the nose, composed of 25 panels of plexiglass, which gave him a breathtaking view of the ground speeding below his feet. He gripped the inside struts of the airframe with exhilaration. Bill yelled out over the intercom, "Woo-ha! Let's give these critters a buzz." He pulled the plane up and veered over a herd of scattering cattle. Their training required low-level flying, and the crew couldn't get enough of it, one time even hooking a piece of sagebrush on the fuselage, dragging it in the wind all the way back to the base. Bill pulled the plane into a high-banked turn. "Let's bring her on home, boys. That's enough for today." Peering over the landscape with wide eyes, Jake was like a kid on a roller coaster. In the base meeting room, Jake sat among a sea of 160 khaki shirts and black ties, all captivated by Jimmy Doolittle, a reactivated officer who was briefing them on what was being called the Special B-25 project. "I know it's low for a bombing run, but you'll have better accuracy on your targets at 1,500 feet, and you'll be less likely to be hit by anti-aircraft fire. No need to practice at any other height," Doolittle said. At a stocky 5 feet 4 inches, Jimmy Doolittle wasn't an imposing man to Jake, but he towered above all in specialty aviation. With a reputation for daredevil flying stunts and a doctoral degree in aeronautic engineering from MIT, he was a strange mix of renegade and scholar, perfect for this mission. Jake noticed Jimmy's slightly irregular nose, a bit bent from his boxing days, and perhaps a plane crash or 2. Doolittle pointed to someone beside Jake with a raised hand. "Yes?" George Barr, the red-haired navigator on Jake's crew, lowered his hand. He had a wide, thin moustache and a heavy Brooklyn accent. "Hey, boss, I understand you can't tell us where we're going, but we all know with these extra fuel tanks and all, well, it's going to be over the river and through the woods, so to speak. And, honestly, sir, I just don't know if these planes are up to it." Another airman jumped in. "Colonel, our carburetors are all out of whack." "And the exhaust pipes are breaking right off," from another. Jake turned toward the gum, chewing Harry Spatz, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed gunner from Kansas on his plane who spoke with exasperation. "After 5 rounds, my machine gun jams. Every time. I might as well be throwing rocks." "Mine too," another said, "and our extra fuel tank leaks like a sieve." As the room turned into a chorus of complaints, Jimmy motioned with his hands for quiet. All right. Pipe down. The planes are brand new and untested. I can assure you we're working on all these things. Remember, I'm flying one of these birds just like you. We've got 2 weeks left and—" "You got to be kidding," someone muttered. "And I'm going to see to it that we get 'em all worked out. Now listen, you boys know that not a word of this mission is to be spoken to anyone. Not your wife, not your friends, or even your dog. Doing so could jeopardize the mission, many lives, and even get the FBI on your backs as well. I've said it before, but I need to say it again. If anyone wants to drop out, he can. No questions asked." Jake never wanted to be on this mission in the first place, But now, with the anticipation and excitement of the unknown, the whole idea pulled him in. He smiled. This was going to be something else. Madras, Oregon. A red 1933 Ford pickup pulled up to the front porch of the ranch house in a cloud of dust illuminated by the afternoon sun. Mrs. Andrus, cradling a black and white cat in her arms, walked onto the porch, letting the screen door smack against the frame behind her. Shutting the truck door, Mr. Andrus stepped around the Ford and handed her a rather beaten-up package and a few letters. She looked puzzled. "I sent these over 2 weeks ago to Jake. Why'd they come back?" Mr. Andrus took off his faded, greasy John Deere cap and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Still holding the cat, she slowly read aloud the handwritten red lettering on the top of the box. Location classified. Return to sender. He must have been transferred. She gave the box a shake to hear a muffled rattle inside and looked down at the cat with a grin. Well, I suppose his brother won't mind eating Jake's cookies, then. Chapter 37. April 1st, 1942. San Francisco Harbor. The carrier USS Hornet. Out of hell, Jake's B-25 hung high above the docks, suspended mid-air as it was carefully swung onto the aircraft carrier USS Hornet by a crane. Standing on the dock below, Jake and the crew all shielded their eyes from the brilliant sun as they watched. The dock reverberated with trucks unloading supplies, officers barking orders, and the ship's complement of nearly 3,000 sailors preparing to set out. A steam whistle from a harbour ship echoed in the distance. George, their navigator from New York, squinted with one eye shut. "You know, I don't remember the part about landing on an aircraft carrier. Any of you boys remember that part?" Jake said, "You can forget about those round-trip tickets," still looking up as their plane moved toward the carrier. "This is going to be a one-way trip." Their co-pilot from Texas, Bob Height, spoke with a cigarette pinched in his teeth. "Yeah, but where to?" "I don't get it." Harry, the gunner, chomped his gum with his mouth wide open. "Some say we're taking the long road to Germany." Bill, the pilot and leader of the pack, took off his hat and scratched his head and spoke with his refined twang. "Well, whatever it is, we're going to be all-right in the middle of it." Jake turned out of the glaring sun toward Bill. "You said you got a girl waiting for you?" Without looking, Bill nodded. "Lib Sims, a fine lady. We're getting married as soon as we're all back home from this thing. I told her June, just 2 months away." Harry looked at his buddies. "Ah, today's April Fool's Day. You don't suppose—" George shook his red-haired head. "The most expensive prank in American history? Uncle Sam's too cheap for that." "You know," Bill said, "I had guys waving $100 bills at me to take my place a couple days ago." "And?" Jake said. Bill turned to Jake and grabbed his shoulder. "I told him, not a chance, pal. I wouldn't miss this for $1,000,000. The following foggy morning, as USS Hornet slid beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, escorted by 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and an oiler, Jake looked off the back of the carrier. He stood on the deck beside his plane in the Thanos 16 position and eyed the tail hanging over the churning foam below, the last plane in the back. He gazed high above at the underside of the impressive, brand-new red bridge, nearly 2 miles wide, both ends fading into the grey mist, then reached out and pulled on one of the tie-downs on his plane and slid his hand over the engine cowling. The planes were covered with black tarps to protect them from the highly corrosive salty air. Examining the nose art of Bat Out of Hell, Jake wondered, really, what the hell he had gotten himself into. An adventure or a death wish? His pilot had never launched from a carrier before. They'd been practicing short takeoffs for a while, but not knowing why. Now he knew, but no one had ever even tried to launch a B-25 from a carrier before, and his plane would be fully loaded with fuel and extra fuel, not to mention 4 500-pound bombs. Jake checked a bug spot on his plexiglass windshield, spit on it, and rubbed it off with his thumbnail. His mum back home didn't have any idea where he was, and she wouldn't know until the mission was complete, or he was dead. Maybe she'd never know. Shoulder to shoulder in a noisy, packed galley for lunch, Jake jabbed his fork into a piece of chicken, then dabbed it into the potatoes and gravy. With his mouth open, just as he was about to take the bite, he was interrupted by a crackle in the PA system. "Attention all crew members of USS Hornet." The room quickly fell silent. Jake felt like his heart stopped beating. "Captain Mitcher would like to inform you that this task force is bound for Tokyo." The room erupted into deafening cheers and shouts. Harry the gunner looked at Jake. "Holy mackerel, Andy! Tokyo!" Jake grabbed his glass of milk and held it out for a toast. "Here's to payback, American style." His 4 other crew members grabbed their glasses, clinked them together, and drank down their milk as shouts of men blended into a repeating chant. Hi-ho, it's off to Tokyo, we'll bomb and blast and come back fast. Hi-ho, hee-ho, hee-ho. Jake jumped up and pounded his chest with his fists. "Tokyo, we're coming to get you!" Perhaps for the first time in his life, Jake knew exactly what he was doing and where he was going. Little Jimmy Doolittle stood before the flyers in the dimly lit briefing room, an 8-foot-wide map of Japan behind him marked with flight routes to several cities, as an officer passed out manila envelopes to crew members. Jake noticed a real hornet's nest on branch behind Doolittle, a reminder of the pain they'd soon inflict on their enemy. The officer held up an envelope marked classified and called out, "Farrow? Lieutenant William Farrow?" Bill raised his hand and reached out to get his flight instructions. Doolittle continued, waving some papers as he spoke. 13 crews are assigned to attack the Greater Tokyo area. 2 will hit Nagoya and 1 will hit Kobe. Your flight plans have it all spelled out. Jake leaned into Bill beside him, who riffled through his papers and whispered back, "Nagoya." Jake nodded and leaned to George, the navigator, on his other side. "Nagoya." Doolittle looked to his right at a Japanese-American officer. "Lieutenant Commander Jirika, here is our intelligence officer who spent the last 2 years in Japan locating and pinpointing industries, refineries, aircraft plants and other military objectives. He'll brief you on your particular targets, including areas of anti-aircraft installments to avoid." He tossed the papers onto a small table to the side. "Soon we'll be joined by Halsey's task force with the carrier Enterprise for air protection while we're en route. As we head into Japanese waters, we'll be on alert. We could be hit at any time by enemy subs. If an enemy carrier sends aircraft against us, we'll have to shove all the B-25s overboard to put our fighters in the air to protect the ships." Jake turned to Bill and raised his eyebrows, thinking that it'd be a shame coming all that way for nothing. Doolittle pointed back to the huge map and raised his voice. "The Japs have been telling their people that they're safe, that we can't hit 'em." He smirked, dropping his hand. "As some of you may have heard, a radio report in English was picked up from Tokyo the other day, stating, and I quote, that it's absolutely impossible for enemy bombers to get within 500 miles of Tokyo." Chuckles rippled through the ranks. "Our job is to let 'em know that we can. The Japanese are a proud people, and more than bringing down their cities, we want to bring down their pride." He began wrapping the back of one hand into the palm of the other. "Look for targets of opportunity to inflict the maximum damage with your bomb load, manufacturing plants, fuel depots, anything that looks like it'll burn. If we can get a few fires going in their cities of paper and wood, they'll never put 'em out. The low-level training we did was to keep you under their air cover and for better accuracy, but they'll still be firing at you from the ground and there'll be interceptors after us for sure. After the attacks, you'll fly to designated airfields in China where they'll be ready to recover your aircraft." With his hands on his hips, Doolittle spoke like a father to his sons. "I want every crew to get this clear. You're to bomb only military targets. I don't want any of you hotshots getting ideas about bombing the Imperial Palace. It's not worth a plane factory, a shipyard, or an oil refinery, so leave it alone. There's nothing that would unite their nation more than bombing the Emperor's home. It's not a military target. Got it? Jake's heart pounded. This was going to be something. Early April 1942, the open sea east of Singapore. Cigar smoke filled the air of Nagumo's brass-appointed personal quarters as Fuchida paced before his desk. So much success, he thought, can breed a false sense of confidence. Nagumo listened to him, but he wasn't sure he actually heard him. The Admiral leaned back in his desk chair, rolled the cigar between his fingers, took a slow, confident puff, and blew the smoke to the side. "We've just sunk 2 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and the British carrier Hermes," Nagumo recounted, "all by air power, and we haven't lost a single ship or even suffered a scratch of paint on any ships. How can you possibly complain?" He drew in another puff of his cigar. Nagumo's muscular strike force of 5 carriers, 4 battleships, and 25 other vessels traversed the sea heading northeast on their way back to Japan. Their mission to cut off British supplies to Burma and to seek out and destroy British fleet units in the Indian Ocean was yet another distinguished success. Like Nagumo, Fuchida was equally amazed at how quickly they had annihilated the British, their former partner who had ruled the seas for centuries, and even felt a measure of sadness at their demise, but he couldn't shake his uneasiness. "Admiral," Fuchida said, "I agree that we have been more than successful in what we have been attempting to accomplish. I'm sorry I must say this, but I see a big problem here." Nagumo raised an eyebrow. "The Americans remain our #1 enemy, but we're spending our valuable time and resources on the southern operation while leaving other resources completely unused." He momentarily leaned on Nagumo's desktop. "What's the difference between their sunken battleships on the bottom of the Pearl Harbor and our anchored battleships at Hiroshima Bay?" Fuchida pushed off the desk and stood upright. "Respectfully, Admiral, I don't think they're being properly utilized. I believe we should be attacking our real enemy, the United States," he said as he pointed east. Nagumo calmly leaned forward and tapped off the ashes of his cigar. "You know that the southern operation is essential to secure resources for our empire. All the commanders are in agreement on this. Our Zeros are unmatched in the skies. Our torpedo bombers can dispatch capital ships in minutes, and the confidence and experience of our men are without equal. We have nothing to be afraid of, and I'm surprised that you would doubt our strength." "Admiral, I don't doubt our power. Our men have performed superbly, but if we fail to destroy the American carriers while they have even the least ability to fight, they'll have hope. That hope must be destroyed. I believe we must go east as soon as possible." Fuchida glanced out through a porthole. "Even as we speak, the Americans are gathering strength." The Eagle's Talons, April 12, 1942. USS Hornet. "2," Jake said. With his sleeves rolled up and a cigarette dangling from his lips, Jake snapped down 2 cards onto the table of a 4-man poker game scattered with red, yellow, blue, and white poker chips. The sun beamed in through the smoke-filled room of pilots and sailors killing time. The dealer had a pack of cigarettes rolled up into the sleeve of his T-shirt. He squinted and flicked 2 cards which Jake snatched up. "Those weren't the 2 I was thinking of." Whistling green eyes again, Bill walked up behind Jake and shook his head as Jake looked back abruptly. "Now don't go letting everyone know how bad my hand is. I'm gonna bluff, all right?" "Perfect." Bill put his hand on Jake's shoulder. "Any of you boys gonna join us upstairs in a bit for the chapel service?" "Great," Jake thought. "We got a Holy Joe in the poker room." Jake liked Bill all right, but he had to draw the line somewhere. No one moved. The dealer spun out 3 cards to another player. Jake didn't look back. "I'm here to kill Japs and maybe make a couple of bucks along the way, but, put in a good word for me. I could use some help right about now." "Sure, I understand." Bill smiled to the players with a nod and a grin. "See you guys at dinner?" "Well, make your bet," Jake said. April 12, 1942, downtown Nagoya, Japan. Evening patrons crowded the popular restaurant of Nagoya, dimly lit by white-hanging paper lanterns, but Amayo, a young lady of 19, could see no one but her fiancé across the table where they knelt. Her red and white kimono complemented her dark red lipstick and fair skin. As Kenji tried to quietly slurp his noodles, Amayo glanced around embarrassingly, then looked back into Kenji's eyes while trying to hold back her smile. He set down his bowl and chopsticks and picked up his tea. 3 more months." 3 months, she said. They gazed at each other, half smiling, as only young lovers can do. "I've never known time to go so slowly." Amayo picked up a piece of tempura with her chopsticks. She was relieved they could be together unaccompanied by family and savoured the moment, but was getting impatient. "Is your grandfather able to come to the wedding?" "He says he will. I'm so happy he's able to come. It's a long trip for him and he hasn't been well." Kenji cast his eyes around cautiously, then reached out and placed his hand on top of Amayo's. "If you're happy, I'm happy." April 18th, 1942, Nagoya. With a lunch can slung over a shoulder, Kenji trudged down the narrow wood-paved alley in the early morning, wearing white coveralls, a pair of leather gloves tucked in his belt. Coming to a doorway, he glanced around and quietly tapped on the wooden doorframe and whispered, "Amayo?" He listened for an answer. "Amayo." He turned his head as a man rode by on a rickety bicycle with a bundle on his back. On the matted floor inside her room, Amayo rolled over, sleeping soundly. Kenji peered down at his watch, looked around, then knocked on the frame again, this time harder. "Amayo, I've got to go to work. I'll see you tonight." With her eyes barely open, Amayo stared for a few seconds, then realized that what she thought she was only half dreaming wasn't a dream. She grabbed her kimono and threw it on, slid her bedroom door open and quickly tiptoed to the front door to not wake her parents. Creaking it open, to her surprise, no one was there but an old woman walking by with a basket of vegetables. She leaned out further and looked up and down the alley both ways. Her long black hair fell across her face as her eyes drifted toward the ground. She couldn't believe she'd missed him. As she receded into the house, a gleam of red caught her eye. Catching the sunlight was a red origami crane with her name written on it squeezed into the edge of the doorframe. Carefully plucking it out, she looked back down the empty street with a smile. "Thank you, Kenji," she said. April 18th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean, 700 miles east of Japan. The massive USS Hornet turned into the drizzling wind and powered up to full speed, rising and falling on the churning white-capped seas as 16 B-25 bombers waited in launch position with their engines rumbling. In the number 1 plane sat Jimmy Doolittle and his crew. The eyes of every sailor in the overloaded tower and on the packed deck stared intently as he went through the last check of his ailerons, rudder, and elevator. Jake stood with his crew as apprehensive as the rest, his mouth hanging open a bit. Doolittle had the shortest runway distance because of the 15 bombers behind him, leaving him exactly 467 feet, which was less than half the distance the plane was designed to need to get airborne. Every plane had been modified for the mission with 3 extra fuel tanks and given 10 5-gallon cans of gas, nearly doubling the range, but also adding 2 tons to the total weight, putting it right at the very limits of still being able to fly. At least that was the calculated assumption. Instead of 3 football fields of length to get into the sky, they had 1.5. Every time Bill, Bob and Jake had paced off the length of the runway in the preceding days, Bill kept shaking his head. If you didn't get airborne by the end, you'd just fall into the sea, probably upside down. Jake leaned to Bill and shouted over the droning of the engineers. Well, if he can't make it, no one can. The entire mission hinged on this one plane successfully making it into the air. "He's Doolittle. He'll make it," Bill shouted back. While holding the brakes, Doolittle revved up both engines full throttle, shaking the wingtips, waiting for the right timing to the rise and fall of the ship. The flagman dropped his checkered flag, the engineer yanked the wheel chocks, and Doolittle released his B-25, roaring down the runway into the misty headwing. Jarke clenched his fists on the opening of his jacket. The plane approached the end of the deck, and dropped, then struggled into the air. The crew broke into ecstatic cheers, flapping of their hats in the air as flight teams began scrambling to their own aircraft. Doolittle's plan was to launch the aircraft 400 nautical miles off the coast of Japan in the early evening hours of the 19th for a night raid. But the discovery of a Japanese fishing boat, suspected of being part of an early warning radio picket line, forced the immediate launch of all planes from over 700 miles out a day early. The Japanese vessel was quickly blown out of the water by the cruiser USS Nashville, but not before it had apparently sent out a radio signal that the Americans picked up. From this launching location, it would be impossible for any of the aircraft to reach their designated landing points in China. They'd also be attacking in broad daylight, and, if the radio signal from the fishing boat was received in Tokyo, the Japanese military might well be waiting and fully prepared for the meagre attack of 16 unescorted bombers. The entire operation was now in jeopardy of being a complete disaster. The Yolkha 2 plane inched into position as other engines revved into roars behind him. The flagman waved the next plane off down the runway as Bill Farrow, in the MAP 16 position, warmed up the engines of the Bat Out of Hell. A sudden gust of wind whipped into the plane, lifting the nose in the air and tipping the back down toward the water. Jake dropped his bag and lunged for the nose wheel and grabbed hold with a group of sailors who fought to bring the bucking animal under control. Others furiously grabbed ropes under the wings. The front wheel slammed down to the deck. To Jake, things were looking like they could have been a disaster before they even left. His heart was pounding. Their plane nearly tumbled backwards into the sea. As the Takata 15 plane in front of them, TNT, revved up to move forward, the blast of air knocked a sailor behind the plane off balance. Bill watched in horror from his pilot's seat and screamed through his open window. "Look out!" The sailor slid on the wet deck into their left propeller, instantly severing his left arm and flinging him to the deck. Jake and 3 others bolted over and carried him off to the side while pressing a jacket onto his bleeding shoulder. Stunned but conscious, the sailor gazed up at Jake with his striking blue eyes, blood oozing onto the rain-soaked deck. "Give 'em hell, Jake. Do it for me, will ya?" "You got it, pal." He would never forget those crystal blue eyes. Never. "Get moving, number 16, a crewman yelled. Jake ran back to his plane, threw his bag up into the hatch, climbed aboard, and pulled the hatch shut. Inside, the roar of the engines was nearly as loud as outside. Bill taxied forward as Jake shimmied on his belly through a narrow passageway to his nose position. Crawling out of the square tube, he was greeted by a gust of wet wind coming in through a jagged, foot-wide hole in the plexiglass just to the right of his machine gun. "Hell no!" He stared. It must have happened during the confusion when the plane was being thrown around by the wind, he figured, and somehow grazed the tail of the plane ahead of them. This could make for a miserable 13-hour flight and could even jeopardize their mission as the added drag could cut down their range. Jake yanked on his headset and strapped his throat microphone around his neck to notify Bill while the plane inched forward. Maybe they just shouldn't go. He watched the wet wooden deck planking roll before him through his nose windshield, then glanced at the rows of eyes outside fixed on his plane. Some men gave him a thumbs up. There were only seconds for him to decide. Telling Bill about the gaping hole in the nose could easily get the mission scrubbed, a mission he still wasn't completely sure about. He put his hand on his throat microphone and blinked a few times as he watched the flagman motioning the plane into takeoff position. The plane came to a halt as the engines began to ramp up. Jake swallowed hard, then shoved his arms into the seat harness and buckled in. With the flagman's release and the plane throttling up to full power, the acceleration pressed Jake into his seat with deafening vibrations. The runway sped past him and disappeared into the ocean below, and the plane climbed and banked wide left, circling to join two other planes in their group of three. Jake looked down to see the ships turning in unison toward the west, giving him a chill with a new thought. The next safe place they could land was 2,400 miles away, and everyone knew there was little chance anyone was going to make it. Having their bearings, the plane dropped to a height of 100 feet above the ocean to duck under any possible enemy radar. When Jake told Bill about the hole, he sent the co-pilot, Bob, to shimmy up front to see if he could help fix it. He and Jake tried plugging it with a jacket, but it just kept blowing in. Eventually the drag made them drop behind of the two other B-25s in their formation, and they eventually lost sight of them. They were alone over the Pacific. About an hour in, Bill broke the silence of the head-numbing drone of the two 14-cylinder Wright R2600 engines. "Hey, Jake!" Bill shouted over his headset. "Yeah?" "That fella who fell into the prop, you know him?" Jake glanced to his left at the whirring propeller, spinning only a few inches from the fuselage, then at the endless horizon of the ocean through his windshield. Bob Wall. He beat me out of $27. Bill looked at his co-pilot, who shook his head. "That's a crying shame. Hope he pulls through." "Yeah, me too. Just hope all the worst is behind us now." Keeping his headset on to dull the oppressive drone, Jake pulled his jacket over his chest, kicked up his feet, wedged his head into the corner, and sighed as the wind rushed around him. One thing was certain. There was no turning back. April 18th, 1942. The open seas, southwest of Japan. The aircraft carrier Akagi. Fuchida sat alone in the flight personnel standby room, flipping through an aircraft parts folder when an orderly barged in. "Sir, Commander Gender requests you immediately in the operations room." Arriving at the room, he saw Gender, Vice Admiral Nagumo, and a number of officers hunched over the map table. "What's going on?" Gender looked up at Fuchida with a smile and handed him a report. "Well, Fuchi, they've come at last." He took a triumphant puff of his cigarette. Fuchida snatched the paper of the last transmissions of the patrol boat Nito Maru, 0630, sighted what appeared to be 3 enemy carrier-borne aircraft. 0645, sighted 1 enemy carrier. 0650, sighted 3 enemy carriers. 0730, large enemy formation. A chill of joy and fear ran through his body as he took it in. The Americans were going to attack Japan. It seemed unbelievable. So early in the war, the Americans were setting out to attack? They would be squashed in a textbook battle, just like his instructors had predicted. The chance to destroy the American carriers exhilarated him. This is our real enemy, the U.S. Navy. "The patrol boat hasn't been heard from since," Gender said, "but they managed to let us know of the approach of the Americans and their location. Headquarters has ordered tactical method number 3. Gender paused. "We're to intercept and engage the enemy." Gender turned back down to the map as Fuchida squeezed into the group. Nagumo thumped his finger just between Formosa 12 and the Philippines. "Here. We are right here." He slid his hand to the right of Japan out into the open ocean and thumped his finger again. "And here is where the formation was spotted." He removed his hand, stood upright, and looked at Fuchida. 650 miles away. This is just what we had hoped for. Fuchida smiled. "And they'll need to be within 300 miles of Japan before they can even begin to launch aircraft for an attack. That'll leave us with about a day to meet them head to head." He squinted with skepticism. Such a small force. What could they possibly hope to accomplish? Nagumo grinned. "Admiral Yamamoto has ordered the carriers Soryu and Hiryu to speed to the coast as well. We'll have our air defense on full alert tomorrow, and our carriers will be prepared to annihilate the Americans as soon as they arrive." He turned back to Fuchida and clapped his hands together briskly. "We've got them right where we want them. The Pacific Ocean, just east of Nagoya, Japan." George the navigator pored over his chart-making measurements. He tapped the pilot in front of him. "Hey, Bill, we should be seeing the coast soon." "Roger that," Bill said. Jake leaned forward in the nose, straining to see. "Yeah, baby. There it is." Bill asked, "Harry, you awake back there?" In his top plexiglass gun turret, Harry rubbed his eyes. Yeah. "Keep your eyes peeled for Zeros. We're the last of the bunch. They gotta know we're coming." Harry cocked each of his 2 machine guns. "I'm all eyes back here." He studied the sky, unwrapped a piece of gum, and folded it into his mouth as the pilot brought the plane up to 1,500 feet for their bombing run. Kenji stepped through an array of parallel pipes beside a row of 6 huge white cylindrical tanks, each 40 feet tall. 2 nearby workers in white gripped a large steel valve wheel. "Turn the first valve 3 revolutions to the left," Kenji said while pointing. "Then wait for about 5 seconds." He watched and waited while the workers turned the wheel and looked back at Kenji. "That's right. Now do the same for the second." Another worker called out from 50 feet away. "Kenji, come look at this control box." "I'll be right back," he said as he pulled off his gloves. Jake's plane roared over houses and buildings, startling the people in the streets who looked up. Bill yelled over the intercom, "Coming up, Jake! The refinery!" Jake pushed hard on the lever in the floor to open the bomb bay doors, flipped a toggle switch on the control panel from safe to arm, then shut one eye as he took aim down the bomb site and watched the target gradually come into view through his plexiglass nose. The simple handmade sights were made especially for this one low-level mission. "I got it. I see the fuel tanks." His left hand was poised just below the switches to release 2 incendiary bombs. Anti-aircraft fire began bursting from the ground, shaking their plane. Staring down the bomb site, Jake flipped the switches, accidentally sending 3 bombs instead of 2. "Sayonara!" Kenji froze as he and the others looked up to the sound of pounding anti-aircraft fire and the approaching aircraft. Instantly a bomber roared overhead, followed by a concussion that erupted into gigantic fireballs of exploding fuel. "Kenji!" 2 workers yelled in unison from across the way as others leaped for cover. Kenji sprinted and stumbled from the wicked inferno as the flames erupted behind him. The plane banked into a high left turn to head for the next target. Jake gazed back at the boiling flashes of brilliant orange inside the clouds of jet-black smoke. "Oh yeah, now see how it feels!" To his right in the distance, he saw more columns of smoke from the bombing strike of the Saga-14 plane as well. "Heads up, Jake," Bill said. "Aircraft factory coming up." Jake took aim again and waited for the buildings to align with the point of his bomb sight. Anti-aircraft fire from the ground burst in the sky in front of him. "Jake, let's go. We're getting some heat and need to move out." Okay, bombs away." He flipped the last switch as they passed over a long set of industrial buildings which were ripped into a flaming explosion. Ground fire tracers shot in front of the plane from multiple angles. "Hey! They're shooting at us!" "Yeah, I don't think they like us." Bill pulled the plane into a steep right turn and headed back out over the ocean. Jake turned his eyes back to the blazing building with satisfaction. "Now that's American barbecue." Leaving the coastline, Bill dropped the plane down to 100 feet again above the water and headed southwest along the coast. Jake spotted a fishing boat in the distance and grabbed his .30 caliber machine gun in the nose, gave it a hard rack, and swung it onto the target. The fishermen, far from the explosions and expecting only to see friendly aircraft over their waters, smiled, jumped up, and began waving their arms at the approaching airplane. "Greetings from the USA," Jake said, and let loose 25 rounds at the helpless fishermen, pocking the water and splintering wood across their boat. "Cut it out, Jake!" Bill yelled over the intercom. "Military targets only!" Jake let out a sigh and stroked the gun like a pet dog as the gun smoke swirled around him. The fishermen looked at each other in shock and confusion, baffled but unhurt, as the sound of the B-25 faded into the distance. Jake's heartbeat began to slow, and he took an extra big breath and exhaled slowly. Mission accomplished. Now they were heading toward China, the night and the complete unknown, somewhere over China. Night swallowed day as Jake and the crew made it across the East China Sea into China, over 1,000 miles from Nagoya. Jake had abandoned his post at the nose earlier and took a seat next to George, the navigator, behind the pilots. Over China, in near pitch-black darkness, the plane flew above dark satin clouds eerily illuminated by the slimmest crescent of the moon. George ran his finger across a flight map under a dim light bulb. Bill came in over the intercom. "We're in a tough situation, fellas. In this weather, we can't find our rendezvous point to land, and I can't drop below the clouds because we might bump into something, like a mountain. So I'm going to keep on a southwest course to see if we can run out of this weather and make a landing somewhere in free China." "Hey, Bill," George piped in. "I say we fly due west for 50 minutes, then head south and bail when we run out of fuel. At least that way we'll be out of Jap territory." "Can't do that, George. It's all mountains to the west, and I want to get this plane on the ground in one piece." George glanced at Jake beside him and shook his head. An hour later, George couldn't wait any longer. "Hey, Bill, we got to find the airfield soon if we're going to land on wheels and not on our own 2 feet in a rice paddy." "Bob, how much fuel we got left?" Bob scanned the fuel gauges, then looked down at his notepad with his calculations. "I figure another 15 minutes or so, but I wouldn't count on it. We've been in the air over 13 hours. "Any radio contact with our airfields?" "No response on any frequencies. Where are we?" George glanced over his chart. "Best I can calculate, just southwest of Nanchang, Jap territory." Jake clearly read the faces of all. It wasn't looking good. In the hands of the enemies they'd just bombed wouldn't be a very good prospect. A red light and buzzer came up on Bob's panel. He reached over and flipped off the buzzer, but the light stayed on. Bill looked around. "That's all she wrote, boys. Let's just hope this is unoccupied China, or we're in a mess of trouble. Everybody out. If we get out fast enough, maybe we can regroup on the ground." Jake checked his parachute straps, his .45 pistol and his flashlight. George released the floor hatch into the rushing wind and blackness below, hung his legs out, and took one last serious look in the faces of his mates. "I guess I'll be seeing ya." He dropped out of the plane. For the first time, Jake was gripped with the fact that he wasn't ready to die. But he resigned himself to the thought that this is the way he'd lived, and this is the way he'd die. No changing it now. He sat down and dangled his legs into the wind, which whipped them hard against the opening. Bracing his hands on the frame, he pushed himself down and fell out into the darkness as the plane shrieked away. He gave a firm yank on his ripcord and the parachute blossomed open. As the drone of his plane faded into the clouds, he found himself drifting in total quiet for the first time in what was the longest, noisiest, most intense day of his life. Enveloped by the mystical night, he could see nothing in the darkness and fog, and could barely even feel the wind as he floated down with the rain. Swinging from side to side, he felt strangely alone. Nearly 3,000 miles away, at the same moment in Madras, Oregon, Mrs. Andrus woke from her sleep. She blinked groggily and rolled toward her husband and whispered loudly, "Hiram? Hiram?" He groaned. She pulled the covers down and sat up. "I had this dream, a dreadful feeling, like I was dropping down, down, down." Go to sleep." "No, something's happened," she said. "I've got to pray for Jake." She leaned to the nightstand, pulled the chain on the light, got up and put on her rose-patterned quilted robe. Facing a chair next to the window, she grasped the seat and lowered herself to the floor onto her knees. Resting her forehead onto her folded hands, she poured out her heart to the God of heaven to please, please help her son, wherever he was. Early a.m., China. Jake still couldn't see anything as he stared down through the rain, prepared for the worst, and wondered where he'd land. In a rice paddy? On a rooftop? In the trees? On the pavement? Suddenly the ground rose up below him, and he crumpled into the mud with a hard jolt as his chute drifted down beside him. He got up onto his hands and knees and rubbed his ribs, which he'd somehow banged a bit on the landing, then hugged a mound of damp soil next to him in relief. Ah, dirt! Unhooking his parachute in the dim fog and drizzle, he saw he was surrounded by dozens of square white posts with oriental writing on them. A Chinese graveyard. Whoa! He looked around a little surprised. I hope I'm not joining you guys any time soon. He stood up, drew his M19 Walevan 45 and cocked it, slowly peered in all directions, then held it high in the air and fired off one round and waited for an answer. Nothing. Nothing but the steady pelting of rain. He realized his luck to have landed on the mound of graves, as all around him were flooded rice paddies. He fired off 2 more rounds and waited again. Nothing. Holstering his weapon and pulling out his knife, he crouched down and cut off a strip of parachute silk, wrapping his head to keep the water off, then trudged off down a muddy path looking for shelter for the night. After some time he came upon what appeared to be a small brick shrine, just big enough for him to sit in and keep out of the rain. It was good enough, and he was beat, so he squeezed in and got as comfortable as he could. In his utter exhaustion, he soon nodded off to sleep to the soothing hiss of rainfall. The dawn sun poked through the grey and white clouds on the horizon and hit Jake squarely in the face, nudging him from his sleep. Squinting, he rubbed his eyes and struggled to free himself from his small quarters and stumbled out. Standing up and stretching, he took a long look around for people and for any kind of road. Not seeing either, he yanked off his parachute cap and headed in the direction that seemed to make the most sense. He needed first to find out if he was safely in Chinese territory or in occupied territory, but what he really wanted was to just find his buddies. Jake came to paddies of rice and found a path, which he followed for over an hour, then started to come upon some people in their houses that looked more like shacks to him. A woman hanging laundry beside some squawking chickens glanced at him for a second, but paid no attention. He passed a couple of men on the road who weren't even suspicious. It seemed strange. If they didn't feel his being there was unusual, it must be a good sign. Finally getting up the nerve, he stopped an older man pulling a small cart loaded with baskets. Jake pointed to himself. "American, me American. You Chinese?" The man smiled and nodded his head without speaking and walked on. Not much help. Coming to a kind of feed store, he wrote a note to the clerk in English. "Me American. Are you Chinese?" The clerk smiled as well, but couldn't read the note. What he thought should be a pretty simple task was proving to be rather difficult. Who were the good guys? After another hour of walking, he eventually came to a main road with telephone lines. Civilization. He was confident of finding help soon, but knew he had to be cautious. As Jake continued, he came to a series of houses with soldiers a ways off the road. Some men were washing laundry in a small creek. Chinese? Japanese? He felt it was safer to just keep on walking. Further down, he came to a house and stopped. He could hear people inside. He needed to determine where he was and had to find some people who could help him. He slowly drew his 45, racked it to put a bullet in the chamber, then reholstered it with the hammer cocked, leaving his hand on his pistol. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to the front door and peered in. He saw 2 young soldiers in khaki-green uniforms playing with some children. The soldiers had gold stars sewn onto their caps, which had a kind of hood down the back of the neck. He had absolutely no idea which force they belonged to. Jake poked his head in. Everyone stopped and stared, but in a friendly way. He motioned to himself with his left hand while keeping his right on his weapon. America. He pointed to one of the soldiers. China or Japan? One soldier smiled and looked to the other soldier, then back to Jake. China! We China! It appeared they knew some English, but he wasn't convinced, so he kept his hand on his gun. The soldiers came up to him and made motions of eating and pointed to Jake's mouth. Food! Food! Jake smiled and nodded. Come! The soldier looped his arm into Jake's, and the two walked him up the road back toward the encampment. As they walked, one soldier pointed to Jake's .45 and shook his head. No gun, no gun. Jake patted his holstered weapon. The gun stays right there, okay? The soldier smiled. Okay. Coming onto the grounds, the other soldiers watched curiously as Jake was walked inside a nicer but equally tiny house, a sort of headquarters, Jake figured. They sat him at a small table and promptly brought out some food, none of which Jake could quite identify except for the tea and the rice. He began wolfing everything down, glancing around cautiously between bites. The two soldiers stood before Jake with their arms folded, smiling and nodding. Suddenly, Jake felt a sharp pain in his back. With his mouth full of food, he looked over his shoulder. 10 soldiers had their bayoneted rifles pointed at his back. An officer in tall black riding boots slowly approached Jake and casually removed his .45, smiling. Jake turned forward, angry. You know, they always told me all you guys looked the same. I should have known. April 19th, 1942. Nagoya, Japan. Workmen in white wrestled fire hoses in the morning light, spraying great arcs of water onto the smouldering, twisted steel of what was left of the destroyed refinery. Scorched holding tanks hissed and breathed out clouds of black smoke above flickering tongues of fire. 5 workers stood or squatted around a partially burned body, half covered in a white sheet. Other bodies covered in sheets lay behind them. Kneeling beside the corpse, folded almost to the ground, Amayo in her pink kimono wept uncontrollably, heaving with near-silent sobs. She had come running when she heard the news early that morning. It didn't seem real to her. It couldn't be real. The men glanced impatiently at each other. Collecting herself, trembling and wiping her face with both sleeves, she sat upright. She nodded to the man with the clipboard. It's Kenji, she said, then crumpled again to the ground in pulsating sobs. The leader jotted a note onto his clipboard and motioned to the others who pulled the cover over Kenji's head. Amayo sat up with her hands to her face and let out a shriek of grief, and collapsed again in tears, this time letting herself wail uncontrollably, her long black hair cascading across the lifeless body. She couldn't believe she would never see him again. Ever. April 19th, 1942. The aircraft carrier Akagi, east of mainland Japan. A flagman guided a Zero fighter as he descended to the deck for a landing. In the operations room, Fuchida, Vice Admiral Nagumo, Genda, and other officers hunched over the map table. At a large lacquered conference table nearby, other officers studied papers and maps. Fuchida shook his head and pointed to a tiny island. No, even Midway is too far for the B-25, and Alaska is impossible as well. They were medium bombers. That's far outside their range. By this time, the news had hit the American newspapers and shot around the world. Fuchida was disgusted that the Japanese newspapers announced that the army shot down 9 planes when none were shot down. Propaganda like that only backfires when people learn the truth, he thought. Nagumo asked, and how did they penetrate our defences? Even though they arrived a day early, we were still on alert. Genda answered, since our fighters patrol at 3,000 metres, they came in at 30 to 60 metres above the ground, dangerously low but nearly invisible to our pilots at that height. Another officer pointed to the map east of Japan. We know they were spotted out here. Fuchida shook his head. But you can't launch land-based medium bombers from a carrier. It's just not possible. So few planes, so little damage. Nagumo exhaled the smoke of his cigar. In the end, it was a wasted attack. Even our newspapers are calling the Doolittle raid the Do-Nothing raid. Fuchida collected himself and stood upright. Respectfully, sir, I must disagree. They've exposed the weakness of our home defences in broad daylight. Nagumo's face darkened. Never before has anyone been able to bomb our homeland. Perturbed, Nagumo looked at the map and back at Fuchida. Then, where did they come from? Fuchida took a long drag from his cigarette to buy time and scanned the map again. I don't know, but I do know this. The Americans had no fear flying straight into the heart of Japan. We failed to shoot down a single plane. Nodding with admiration, he looked Nagumo in the eyes. Whoever these Americans were, they had guts.